I'm Lynette Clementson, and I'm the director of Wallace House here at the University of Michigan. Some of you, I recognize your faces because you're regulars at our Wallace House events, and there are a lot of people who I think are here at one of our events for the first time, and so I welcome you and thank you for coming out for what I think will be a good and really important conversation today with our guest, Lydia Polgreen. And to tell you a little bit about Wallace House is a program here at the university that is here to support the careers of journalists. We run two programs, the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists, which is an academic year-long sabbatical year for mid-career journalists to step away from their work for a year of immersive study here at the university. This year's Knight Wallace Fellows are in the room. If you could just raise your hands so people can see where you are. They'll be around afterward, and I hope you get to meet some of them. We bring 12 U.S. journalists and 6 to 8 international journalists here every year, and they're always studying an amazingly interesting variety of things and going back to do great things in journalism. And so we're thankful to the university for allowing us to house such an important program here, and thankful to all of you who welcome our fellows while they're here in Ann Arbor. Our second program is the Livingston Awards for young journalists, and that is not residential to the university here in Ann Arbor, but it is an annual journalism prize that recognizes excellence in reporting by journalists under the age of 35. We give 3 prizes a year, one for local reporting, one for national, and one for international, and we also give a mentorship award every year. Those awards are held every summer in New York, and some of you from the university come to the Livingston Awards every year. It's a very special event, and it actually has a tie to our guest today because Lydia Polgreen was a Livingston Award winner, and so we're happy to have her here doubly because of that. The program that we're having today is part of the university's annual MLK Symposium, which is always an amazing, amazing collection of inspiring, thought-provoking events. I hope some of you were able to participate in the many, many activities that happened yesterday on campus, and we're happy to add this one. I felt very strongly that Wallace House needed to participate in the symposium this year. The theme of the symposium this year is the fierce urgency of now. And certainly it's a timely theme, and talking about journalism in the context of the fierce urgency of now is something that's very important. And we take our role at Wallace House not just to be to work with journalists, but also to work with the public and help the public engage more closely with journalists and the daily work of journalism. I think it's especially important in a college town when a lot of people get their news directly from their phones and from Facebook and don't have a lot of interaction with a large news organization. And quite frankly, it's important in a town where the newspaper closed, sadly, several years ago in its full on-print form. And so whatever we can do to encourage people to engage with journalism and understand the role that journalism plays in a free and functioning democracy is important work. We take it very seriously, and we're really glad to be a part of the symposium this year. I want to thank our co-sponsors in this event today. We've had support from the Department of History, the Department of American Culture, and the Department of English Languages and Literature, and we believe in collaboration, and so whenever we can work with other departments to bring people out to these events, to get students to these events, and to take the conversations that we start here in these rooms back into departments and classrooms, we are very thankful for that. So thank you to our co-sponsors who are here in the room. And thank you to those who are following us on live stream. I got several emails this week, partly because I think it's just a busy week and people anticipating bad weather, asking me, is it going to be live stream? Can I follow online? And so to at least 10 of you who contacted me directly, and maybe more, thank you for joining the conversation, and we hope that you will participate in questions as well. So we hope to make this a discussion that feels like a town hall, and there are microphones positioned around the room. We'll get to a point where our speaker will invite people to join the conversation. We also are welcoming people to join us on Twitter and people from the live stream. If you tweet your questions, there are people following the conversation on Twitter. We'll make sure that you are included in the conversation. Please, if you're on Twitter, if you could use the hashtag Wallace House so that we know your comments get into the conversation. And you can follow Lydia at L. Polgreen and me at L. Clementson. And we look forward to getting to that part of the conversation. Also, and I'm going to talk about this more at the end, but I just want to, because I know some people may be leaving early, I hope that you got one of these sheets of paper when you walked in. It's about upcoming Wallace House events this semester, and I think we have a number of events that are following on a theme that Lydia will introduce today, and really getting at the heart of some of the things we're talking about on campus now regarding free speech and inclusion. They're tough conversations, but they are conversations that we need to have in a civil way, in public civil forums, and we hope you will join us for those. And I'll talk more specifically about the events at the end of the program. But now, I want to welcome Lydia Polgreen. Lydia Polgreen is editor-in-chief of HuffPost. Before she was in this amazing position, Lydia worked for 15 years at the New York Times. That's where I met her as a sort of fangirl when I was at the New York Times. Lydia spent roughly a decade of that time overseas, and I would follow her byline. And she had a really strong voice, and she seemed always very connected to the countries and the governments and the leaders and the issues that she was grappling with, and she told stories in a beautiful way. And we never worked in the same city at the Times, but we always knew one another, and in the way journalists follow one another. Not the Twitter follower, like the really we read each other's stories kind of following people. So I've known Lydia for many years, and I was really wowed when she left the New York Times to go run Huffington Post, which she's now shortened to HuffPost. Partly because I think people think when you go to the New York Times that is like that's the mountaintop, and you're never going to go any. That's where you end your career, and it was a really brave and bold move for her to go and run HuffPost, and she stepped into it in a way to fully inhabit the role. And when we were thinking about the fierce urgency of now and the MLK Symposium, Lydia was the first person to come to mind, because one of the things that she did in starting the new job was she wanted to get to know the country in a fresh way as she stepped in to run this media organization, and she launched off on a 25-city bus tour to go and listen to people around the country, and to hear the things that they were talking about and the issues that they felt that were important, issues that weren't always being covered in the news. And she felt an urgency about that mandate. And I think she heard a lot about American values at a time when we're really struggling over American values. And so I think I'm going to turn it over to Lydia, and I hope that you will join the conversation. She'll invite us all to questions. And Lydia, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Lynette, for that wonderful introduction. I indeed was a fangirl of yours for a long time, and in leaving the Times to go become the editor-in-chief of HuffPost, I was inspired by your example. You left the Times to be the founding editor of The Root and to do great, great things there. It's such an honor to be here. I was a proud recipient of a Livingston Award. For those of you who don't know the Livingston Award, usually you have to wait towards the middle or end of your career before the industry recognizes how awesome you are. But the wonderful thing about the Livingston Award is that it recognizes emerging journalists. And I won it for some of the most difficult work of my career. I spent a couple of weeks hiking to a tin mine in the heart of Congo, in the heart of the Congolese jungle, and wrote a story about the exploitation of the resources there. And then a second story in that series involved spending weeks in the Sahara Desert with some Tuareg rebels. And it was all about the exploitation of natural resources and how the detrimental effects that it has on ordinary people. So that kind of work seeing it recognized is really, really meaningful. It's also great to be here as part of the Martin Luther King Day celebration. His legacy at this moment could not be more important, and it's a rare gift to be here with you all. I want to talk to you today about American identity, and so I thought I'd start by just telling you a little bit about where I come from. My mother was born in Jimma, which is a city in southwestern Ethiopia. It's not a famous place, but it's known as the birthplace of one of the most great treasures of modern life, coffee. Legend has it that a shepherd named Kaldi noticed that when his sheep ate these berries from a certain plant, they got very excited and energetic. And so Kaldi decided to try eating the berries himself, and coffee was born. My maternal grandfather was a prosperous coffee farmer, and my mother only left Ethiopia when she met my dad, an American from Minnesota. They fell in love and got married. Ethiopia gave the world more than coffee. Scientists believe that Ethiopia was the birthplace of humankind. The oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens, our species, nearly 200,000 years old, were found in Ethiopia's Rift Valley. It's where we all come from. Ethiopia was home to numerous ancient civilizations. They were among the earliest converts to Christianity. They built majestic cities like Aksum and Lalibela, places that contain extraordinary wonders of the world and draw thousands of tourists every year. Virtually alone among sub-Saharan African nations, it was never colonized. The Italians tried, they really tried, but they never fully took control. Ethiopia today is a poor country, having struggled through Marxist dictatorship, famine, and civil war. But it's a proud, ancient, and majestic civilization. The President of the United States has a different word to describe places like the country of my mother's birth: shithole. My father's forebears came from different stock. Like many white Americans, his family tree has roots in many places. One branch leads to Cornwall, another to Sweden. My paternal grandfather was an amateur genealogist, and he swears at least one tendril of our family tree reaches all the way back to the Mayflower. But what all these white folks had in common was simple. They were poor people from countries that could really only be described at that time as shitholes. They were fleeing poverty and cramped opportunity for a new life in a place that they hoped would reward their enterprise and their ingenuity. For the most part, it did. My paternal grandfather was a belly gunner in World War II, fighting in the Pacific. He studied engineering on the GI Bill. He settled into a great career at a great American company, 3M, and he worked his way into the upper reaches of the middle class. He was a Goldwater Republican and believer in freedom and individual responsibility. It's easy to see why he believed, like so many of his generation, that he had earned everything he got. It's just how things were meant to be. Access for all Americans to the kinds of opportunity white Americans like my grandfather saw as their rightful portion was the work that Martin Luther King spent his too short life fighting for. It seems wholly fitting that Shithole Gate happened right around Martin Luther King Day. It's an important reminder that the arc of justice is indeed long, and it bends very, very slowly. I've been thinking a lot about American identity in the age of Trump. We all are. It's being debated every day in politics, on Twitter, Congress, in culture. and incredibly heatedly on campuses? Are football players who kneel on the field during the national anthem in protest of enduring racism in America patriots, or are they traitors? Or khaki-clad, tiki torch-wielding marchers in Charlottesville protectors of history or inheritors of the Ku Klux Klan, or both? Does our commitment to free speech end when hateful speech begins? And who gets to decide where that line is? Are immigrants like my mother a source of America's strength, or do they weaken us by diluting some hazily defined American identity that always seems to place my father's white forebears above the rest? Some believe we're a nation of immigrants, the Statue of Liberty nation, all of us weaving together something novel and fibrous and lasting from our disparate experiences and perspectives. This is what most of us were taught in our social studies classes. Some argue, as Chris Hayes did in his book, Colony and a Nation, that we're two nations, one on top of the other. There are the European colonizers and the land who seized the land and made the laws, and for generations of color, and they governed generations of color through white supremacy, slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, encroachment, relocation, genocide. Or perhaps we should listen to the conservative scholar Michael Anton, who, under the pseudonym Publius Decius, wrote, "Diversity is not our strength. It's a source of weakness, tension, and disunion. America is not a nation of immigrants. We are originally a nation of settlers, who later chose to admit immigrants, and later still not to, and who may justly open and close our doors solely at our discretion without deference to forced pieties." Anton now works for President Trump in the White House, and he represents a point of view that has gained a tremendous amount of currency. And this is one of the many debates that's unfolding in our country. But let's be real. This isn't a normal president. This isn't a normal administration. This isn't a normal time. We have what appears to be an ethno-nationalist-influenced regime in the White House, abetted by a far-right Congress with all the contradictions that shotgun marriage implies. We're seeing the rollback of protections of queer people like me. We're witnessing a newly permissive attitude towards hate speech and hate crimes that has led to increased attacks on Jews, Muslims, and all kinds of marginalized people. We're also seeing an increase in intolerance in some corners of the country, particularly on the left, where people would rather shut out views that they don't agree with and not hear. We're seeing people who came to America as young children, who have committed no crimes, who face being exiled to nations they've never known. The president refers to journalists as enemies of the American people, and brooks no dissent. Free speech is whatever his Twitter feed spews out every day. None of this comes as a surprise because Donald Trump rose to political prominence with his birther crusade against President Obama, which many of us treated like lunacy or a joke. But he is actively, through rhetoric, policy, trying to control this question of American identity, to set the terms and language with which we talk about identity. Who's American? Who can come here? Who belongs here? And he and his administration are advancing a vision of America that often seems inimical to our country's history, our traditions, and our fundamental values. It's one thing to hear that from Democrats. It's another thing to see it in the Twitter feeds of John McCain, Mitt Romney, all kinds of political figures across the political spectrum. And for me, as the daughter of an African immigrant, as a person of color, as a queer person, as an American, I'm watching these conversations unfold with particular alarm. I know a lot of people here at this great university who look like me, who grew up like me, who live lives like mine, are feeling the same way. Most of all, I'm alarmed as a journalist. I'd spent a decade as a foreign correspondent, and in that time, I saw too many societies that didn't have the benefits of a robust and free press, that didn't have that rigorous scrutiny. Power was concentrated in too few hands. People didn't trust institutions, private or public. Journalists were censored, or worse, they censored themselves. Facts were ordered and prioritized by the powerful. And there was fundamentally no truth except what the leader said was true. Sound familiar? I could always feel how fragile those places were. America was supposed to be different. It certainly seems that way when you live and travel in places of insatiable grudges, where old ethnic identities bring joy and value, but also pulse dangerously close to the surface. America was a place of optimism, of mobility, of limitless opportunity, of limitless growth and limitless possibility, economic, personal, political, forever moving forward, unencumbered to an almost naive degree by its own history. Alexis de Tocqueville, who's a French nobleman who visited the United States in the 1830s, wrote a landmark book about his travels called Democracy in America. He was bowled over by the unsinkable optimism of this young country. He met a sailor and he asked him, "Why are American ships built so flimsily as to last for only a few years?" Tocqueville writes, "He answers without hesitation that the art of navigation every day is making such rapid progress that the finest vessel would become almost useless if it lasted beyond a certain number of years." In these words, which fell accidentally and on a particular subject from a man of rude attainments, I recognized the general and systematic idea upon which a great people directs all its concerns. Aristocratic nations are naturally too apt to narrow the scope of human perfectibility. Democratic nations to expand it beyond compass. Expanding human perfectibility beyond compass. And it was, in theory, available to everyone. Whether your family had been here 400 years, 40 years, or 4. You could go in a generation from a coffee farm in Ethiopia to editor of a website that reaches 200 million people a month. This is what made American democracy possible to a French nobleman. This equality of opportunity. And we believed it too, in our abiding optimism. It felt especially true during the Obama era, when millions of Americans, people who history had pushed aside, people who looked like me, felt like it was our time. It might have been painful, and it might have been too slow. We might have had to fight really hard for it. And it would continue to fight for it, but there would be progress. We would always keep moving and keep getting freer, richer, smarter, safer, more inclusive, more equal. I spent 10 years abroad as a foreign correspondent trying to see other countries the way that Tocqueville saw ours. I was so passionate about the work. I really loved it. I loved being in the field. And Nigeria was my favorite place to be a foreign correspondent. I arrived in West Africa just a few years after it had made the transition from brutal military rule to democracy, and I was fascinated by this continent within a continent. Its people spoke dozens of languages, worshiped different gods, were forced into unwieldy colonial borders. It wasn't tidy, and yet, somehow, the center held. What struck me as I plunged into its messy political fray was the stark divide between politics on the one hand, which was riven with the worst kinds of corruption, and the vibrant civil society industry, which was purist in its concerns about state violence, about corruption, and so on, and churning out earnest reports on just how terrible things were. These were always backed by the global donor class. But these members of civil society, they didn't engage directly in politics. None of the quote-unquote decent people who had fought to end military rule actually ran for office in the new system. As the Nobel laureate Wallace House said after Nigeria transitioned from military rule to democracy, one ceaseless complaint against the democratic movement is that its protagonist carried out this struggle at immense personal sacrifices of varying dimensions, only to hand over the future responsibilities to proven reprobates and opportunists. Whatever self-retiring principles may have governed the impulses of a number of us in that struggle, we have indeed left the field to brigands, parasites, and unworthy custodians of power and authority, including even collaborators, that in those who have not only made such struggles necessary in the first place, but contributed to our personal woes, and even stained their hands with the blood of our fallen comrades. Gotta love a wordy Nigerian Nobel laureate. I always felt that the strength of civil society in the face of a cynical political system was a sign of a fundamental weakness in a democracy. Why didn't the best people in civil society engage with politics, run for office, imbue the system with their values? Why stick with your cozy job funded by the Soros Foundation at a think tank, rather than have some skin in the game? To be sure, there were risks, including the risk of death. But it struck me as a feebleness that I diagnosed over and over again in places like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. And yet when I returned to America in the twilight of the Obama era, I began to suspect that we had the opposite problem. We had outsourced our civic responsibilities to a technocratic political class, assuming that after we left the voting booth, our work as citizens was done. This hit home really forcefully in a conversation I had with a young German graduate student at Harvard recently. He was studying politics at the Kennedy School, and he had the good fortune to arrive amid the 2016 campaign. He had grown up in social democratic politics, joining a party organ in his high school years, attending leadership camps, working deep in the political movement his entire life. And when he arrived at Harvard, he was really eager to volunteer and get engaged with the 2016 campaign. But when he asked the professor how, the professor shrugged. Well, maybe you could go to a fundraiser. This young man was stunned. The highest form of civil engagement seemed to be raising money to turn it over to the political class. What should be civil society in the United States has become an industry. Think tanks, lobbyists, media. They become so professionalized, so shot through with money, that their ability to be an entry point for civic engagement has been nullified. Not long after I moved back to New York from South Africa, I attended a talk by Brian Stevenson, the civil rights lawyer who defends death penalty cases across the American South. He said that the two high schools in the Alabama city where he lives are named for Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, heroes of the Confederacy. The student bodies of both schools were almost entirely black. In 1976, when school children in South Africa were told they must learn in Afrikaans, the language of apartheid, they went on strike. A 13-year-old boy, Hector Peterson, was killed by the police in Soweto. The searing image of his limp and lifeless body, carried by a schoolmate, ignited the anti-apartheid movement across the globe. I asked myself, why didn't the students of these Alabama high schools go on strike? Demand that their schools reject the names of the heroes of oppression. The truth is that the idea probably never occurred to them, that they could use their bodies, their refusal of consent, to change the world. As a journalist, I believe reporting has the power to change the world. Yet the media ecosystem, like so many other institutions, has seen this extraordinary drift between the haves and the have-nots. Journalism has become a highly elite profession that often feels extremely distant from the experiences of the people that we write about. There are so many journalistic products out there aimed at highly educated, affluent people. I spent almost 15 years working at the New York Times, which produces the most marvelous journalistic product ever created. But as a news organization, it's very much devoted to going out and trying to explain the powerless to the elite subscriber back home. In the years since the election, there's been a lot of hand-wringing among my colleagues. Did we do enough to cover the sentiments that led people to vote for Trump? I've read so much of that coverage. The problem wasn't that we didn't write about them. It's that we didn't write for them. We need to be real about the fact that this is a country with very serious problems. Globalization. It was supposed to increase the total size of the pie, and that everyone was going to get a bigger slice. Technological change and transformation. That was supposed to mean that productivity would grow and that workers would get a bigger share. It didn't work out that way. I'm quoting here, the United States is getting accustomed to a completely crazy level of inequality. That's Thomas Piketty, the French economist behind the unlikely bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century. People say that reducing inequality is radical, he writes. I think that tolerating the level of inequality the United States tolerates is radical. It is indeed a radical departure from our history. Last year, a team of Stanford economists led by Raj Chetty, along with my former Times colleague, David Leonhardt, published an index of the American dream. Using millions of tax records going back decades, they created a data set showing the percentage of Americans who earn more money and less money than their parents at the same age. The index is deeply alarming, David wrote. It's a portrait of an economy that disappoints a huge number of people who have heard that they live in a country where life gets better, only to experience something quite different. Generation X, which is my generation, we're the last that has a better than 50% chance of out-earning our parents. HuffPost recently published a long article about the stark economic fate of millennials, the generation after mine. A reporter found that they face the worst economic prospects of any generation since the Great Depression. If a baby boomer could pay for college with 300 hours of minimum wage work, a millennial today would need to work 4,400 hours. Think about that. When President Trump released his budget last year, one line in particular caught my eye. He proposed gutting the Pell Grant program, which helps the poorest American kids go to college. I was lucky enough to get a Pell Grant when I attended college. It's quite likely I wouldn't be standing here today before you had this small but crucial program aimed at increasing social mobility not existed. Tocqueville was already fretting about this in the 1830s. His awe at our social mobility was inexorably linked to his grave concerns about our individualistic bent and its unintended consequences. He wrote, "If America ever experiences great revolutions, they will result not from the equality of conditions, but on contrary, from inequality. There might come a time when the unruly passions of a few individuals, abetted by the unintelligent cowardice of the majority, would compel society to follow a peculiar course." We are indeed on a peculiar course right now. There is a direct and obvious connection to our current moment. Of course, at various points in our history, we seem to have reached the end of the road. The great American engine of optimism, of our identity, has seemed to sputter to a halt, never to be restarted. The Civil War, the Great Depression, to a perhaps less dramatic degree, the upheaval of the 1960s and the malaise of the 70s. Nowadays, our dream of ever-expanding prosperity and possibility is under attack, and we're facing a time of deeply diminished expectations. Inequality feels baked into our society in a way that can't easily be undone. And climate change, our certain doom, has made it all feel super apocalyptic. The rising seas and temperatures, the cruel droughts and cataclysmic weather. Soon there will be less of the world to live in and fewer people able to live in it. The anger and frustration among ordinary people is not just in the United States, but around the globe. It's palpable. This global upheaval is the subject of the writer Pankaj Mishra's new book, The Age of Anger. He writes, "With so many of our landmarks in ruins, we can barely see where we are headed, let alone chart a path. But even to get our basic bearings, we need above all greater precision in matters of the soul. The stunning events of our age of anger and our perplexity before them make it imperative that we anchor thought in the sphere of emotions. These upheavals demand nothing less than a radically enlarged understanding of what it means for human beings to pursue contradictory ideals of freedom, equality, and prosperity." And that, to me, is about as good a definition of American identity as you can imagine. This relentless pursuit of these contradictory ideals of freedom, equality, and prosperity. So for the last 3 years of my time at the New York Times, I've been working on this global expansion project. I'd go all around the world and talk to people and ask them, what are you looking for in an international media brand? What do you read? Who do you trust? What do you like? I came away from that experience asking myself one question over and over. So my challenge to the young staff that I manage at HuffPost and to all of my colleagues in the media world is always this. Always be asking yourself, who are you for? And for me, the answer is clear and capacious. For me, as a journalist, as a leader at HuffPost, we are for anyone anywhere in the world who feels that the current political and economic power arrangements are fundamentally unfair. That too much political and economic power has accrued to a very small elite. That too many people are on the outside looking in at the prosperity created by globalization and technological change. That the game is rigged, that the deck is stacked, who feel that the House always wins. That definition includes many, many people who voted for Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, but it includes the majority of people who voted for Donald Trump, too. I don't feel like we're doing a great job of telling that story of anger, of voicelessness, in a way that feels true to the people who are actually experiencing it. That's why last fall, HuffPost went on a tour of 25 American cities. We avoided the coasts and the big regional centers, visiting cities like Fort Wayne, Indiana, Livingston, Montana, Odessa, Texas, and of course, Detroit. One of the reasons we decided to hit the road was this burning question in all of our minds in the aftermath of 2016 election. What does it mean to be an American today? We thought we would do the simplest and most powerful thing a journalist can do. We'd listen. We rented a bus and we hit the road. We'd hoped to interview about 500 people over 7 weeks. We weren't sure anyone was going to show up when our bus rolled into town. It turns out that we didn't need to worry. Americans have a lot to say and want to be heard. We spoke to nearly 2,000 people, and what they told us was remarkable. Almost no one talked about Donald Trump. And it wasn't in the Voldemort way, the name you dare not utter. It was that people had much more pressing local issues on their minds. At the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 little black girls were killed in a Klan bombing in 1963, we held a forum on local crime. That night, a largely black audience told their entirely black city leadership, police chief, mayor, DA, that something needed to be done about the plague of violent crime in the city. They demanded a zero tolerance, even stop and frisk. It was an important reminder in the age of Black Lives Matter, when we seek to hold police departments to account for overzealous enforcement policies and outright violence on communities of color, many such communities also suffer from the problem of law enforcement neglect. The complexity and nuance of our community gets lost in shouty headlines and cable news chatter. In Iowa, we heard from people intensely proud of their community's welcoming of refugee and immigrant communities. In New Orleans, we work closely with a local news organization to expose how Airbnb is altering the fabric of the city's historic neighborhoods, hollowing them of local residents and replacing them with tourists. Mostly, though, we heard stories about communities that are facing struggles, but also coming together to solve them, talking, debating, arguing, finding imperfect solutions. And we met resourceful journalists who are managing, despite the tough odds of our business these days, to tell their stories. The experience of traveling this country, much as Tocqueville had, even at this fraught moment, left me optimistic, but not optimistic in the classic American sense. All those conversations affirmed my implacable and old-fashioned belief that solidarity is possible, and that's the greatest source of my optimism. Solidarity is kind of an old-fashioned word, but it's deeper and it's truer than optimism. Optimism has a fragility to it. Optimism can be disproved, it can be disappointed. It can curdle into pessimism. But solidarity, it assumes hardship. It assumes challenge and difficulty and resistance. It exists because of those things and persists despite them. Solidarity, it's core to our country's history and values. It's right there in our founding documents in the first line of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. We, the people. We are seeing glimmers of it building, this wave of solidarity. A sparsely attended inauguration and violent counter-protests were followed immediately by the largest demonstration ever held on American soil, organized and led by women, but joined by hundreds of thousands of men. The executive order banning refugees and immigrants from a handful of Muslim-majority nations was met with a roaring set of demonstrations against that order at airports and government buildings from coast to coast. Many religious conservatives, evangelicals who do important work in these countries, were among those to join on the battle lines. The attempt to repeal Obamacare and deprive 24 million people of their health care was defeated amid a movement that held huge rallies, swamped Congress with calls and letters and emails, and demanded action from their representatives in town halls. Thousands of people who never considered running for office are getting involved in politics for the first time, promising renewal and transformation. Solidarity is our great strength. It's the work and value James Baldwin imagined when he wrote to his nephew, when he imagined making America great again. He said, "If the word integration means anything, this is what it means: that we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton, dammed rivers, built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable and monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, 'The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off.' I feel a tremendous sense of mission and conviction about rushing forward to meet this moment. I want my journalistic home, HuffPost, to become a platform that speaks to a very, very broad swath of America and, frankly, the world, where people can see what they have in common with people who don't share their political beliefs, where real conversation is happening about who gets to define what it is to be an American and what the real America is, and where solidarity becomes possible. It sounds grandiose, I know, and it sounds a little like kumbaya, but my hope is that together we can renew our commitment to solidarity and to civic engagement. It has to happen at the deepest levels of our society and will require great work from all of us. We can no longer abdicate to assumptions about growth and prosperity, that things are forever going to get better. We can't continue to outsource management of our democracy to the professionals and just hope that everything's going to be okay and go about our lives. At our final stop on the Listen to America bus tour, we met an amazing man named Leo who had lived his whole life in New Orleans. He told us about the fragility of his beloved city. I think Katrina really made us appreciate New Orleans because we felt like we were going to lose it, Leo said. There were people talking, maybe we shouldn't rebuild New Orleans. To Leo, that was unthinkable, and he rolled up his sleeves to rebuild the city that he loves. But it got him thinking about the state of our nation, too. He went on, I know in my life, I've never felt like we could lose America until what's been going on in the last couple of years. I hope that America has the same experience that we had in New Orleans, that almost losing it made us appreciate it more, made us decide to work to make sure we don't lose it. We all need to wake up and realize this is our country. We need to listen to each other with respect and with dignity. It's our shared responsibility, mine and yours, to go out there and forge bonds between people. Solidarity will be hard work, but we'll do it, and we'll do it together. Thank you. Well, let's talk.
So there are microphones on the side. You'll see them positioned around. And if you can't easily get to a microphone, raise your hand. Lydia will call on you. We'll make sure you can be heard.
Hi there.
Hi. I'd just like to say I think it's really vile and hateful to call people who disagree with you racists. And that kind of, and I think that kind of disparagement is really both a bogus way of conducting a political argument and really quite similar to calling another person the N-word. I was wondering whether you would agree with me on that or not.
I think that they're pretty different. I think that the word racist is very different than the word nigger.
Racist is a very hateful term, though. You have to agree.
Well, no, I mean,
No?
I don't.
I definitely think that it is. You're really outing somebody and really saying they're beneath contempt. At least that's the way I think most people look at when calling somebody a racist. You know,
And I think some.
you know, and when the N-word is the same way, you're basically treating somebody saying, "Oh, you're beneath contempt." They're both very similar.
The difference is, I'd like a person like you to define what is racism. What is racist? Define the word, and then tell me, does Trump support? Is he, by definition, your definition, a racist? Okay? I can define the N-word. It's a hateful term. Racist.
Yeah, racist is a hateful term too.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is. Because it's saying you're beneath contempt.
No.
It's saying you
My
have,
question is,
I don't need to listen
define,
to you.
define
You
racist.
are
Just give me a
worthless.
definition.
Okay,
Racist.
folks, listen.
Disgusting.
We're here to have a civil conversation.
Yes. Yes,
And I feel that you've asked a question, I've answered it. So,
Okay. Fine.
I don't have much else to add on it.
Again, their definition of the word racist. Just give me that definition, and then I can tell you whether that person is a racist or not.
Sure.
What is the definition that you want to use?
I think it's a fair question. Yes, sir.
Hello. Do Native Americans have an appropriate role in defining American values?
Absolutely. I think that they have, they perhaps are first among equals in in their claim on defining American values. You know, I think that we've seen Native American communities at the forefront of the struggle for basic rights in this country, whether it's the struggle for self-determination and self-governance, which are really core to our identity as Americans, or whether it's the struggle for environmental protection and justice, as we saw with the North Dakota pipeline. So I'd say absolutely they do. Do you disagree?
Does the Huffington Post or any other major media organization offer them a platform?
Sure. I mean, we offer a platform to all people from all walks of life, and have published articles by and about First Peoples, not just here in the United States, but also in Canada, Australia, and other places. So I think it's absolutely essential that those stories be told and be given prominence. So.
I think that's the reality now.
I think it's the aspiration. It's not always the reality. I think we should always work harder to get these stories at the forefront, because I think they're absolutely essential, and they're forgotten. I often think that if the United States could be said to have a national religion, I would say it's amnesia. And amnesia is, and really denial is the opiate of the masses. We're a country that, and this is very much linked to, and why I spent so much time talking about optimism and the forward-lookingness of the United States. We don't want to think about the past. We don't want to look back. We're always moving forward, and like that young sailor, thinking about the better ship that's going to be built 3 years from now, and not worrying about building the ship that we have to last. We're obsessed with the notion of forward motion and progress, and the corollary to that is amnesia, and a fundamental denial about the role that Native peoples have played in our history and our legacy, and I think an even deeper denial about the fundamental role that African peoples who were enslaved played in building this nation and in building its wealth. This country, and this is why the president's comments about Haiti struck particularly hard. Haiti was the most valuable colony in the history of colonization at the time that the revolution happened there. All of the wealth of France was in large part owing to Haiti, and so I think we have a tremendous sense of amnesia and an unwillingness to look at ourselves and see what we really are and what our story really is.
Well, you have raised my other question.
Okay.
That is religion. You didn't really mention it very much in your talk, but if religion, insofar as it does, demeans life and makes afterlife sacred, doesn't that undermine efforts to improve the conditions on Earth, especially in the sense of dominating or thinking of dominating all of life, all of the biosphere, rather than cooperating with it?
I think that there are different spiritual traditions that focus on this life, focus on the afterlife. You've seen a growing environmental movement among people of faith who believe that it's our job to be stewards of God's creation. So I think it's pick your flavor, and different people have different beliefs about it. So thank you, ma'am.
You mentioned that the New York Times is sort of the pinnacle of American journalism, but that it also hits a perhaps limited audience, and that there are other audiences that might need to be reached with important stories. How is the Huffington Post reaching out to other niches, and what does it look like to write for other groups, and how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about with my team because, the reality is that it's very easy just to kind of copy what everybody else does because that's what wins awards, that's what gets attention. Our bus tour was one way, actually going and out and meeting people and talking to them to try and understand from them, what are the stories you want told? What are the things that you care about most? And there's a really interesting bifurcation. When you ask people about things that are kind of in national news, President Trump, Congress, immigration, abortion, they tend to have very polarizing views. But if you ask people about issues that are happening in their community, their views they may be polarized, but they're polarized on completely different lines. And so one of the things we've tried to do is to burrow down a layer and try and write about things that affect people beyond the kind of like big political narratives that are unfolding. The other thing is that when we decide that we're going to write about a big national phenomena, we decide that we're going to write about it from the perspective of ordinary people, of the disadvantaged, the people who aren't necessarily in the limelight in writing about that issue. So when the allegations about Harvey Weinstein came to light, I thought, okay, we could go and try and find more famous actors who've done terrible things, or we could try and find powerful business titans who've done terrible things to women. But maybe a better use of our expertise would be to really burrow into the industries where most people work and try and tell stories about the experiences of women in those industries, because this is not Ashley Judd, this is not Gwyneth Paltrow. Nobody listens to these women. So we did a really powerful story about housekeepers working at hotels who are among the most vulnerable. I mean, they actually go into rooms where people are staying and have to clean the rooms, and they work alone on a floor, and the stories that they told were really, really heartbreaking. So bringing that kind of thing up to the fore, I think, is really important. We also did a story about flight attendants and what they face. And we have some more things in the works, looking at women who work in sales, for example, where there's a really almost explicit expectation that you use your womanly wiles to do your job. So that's sort of how I interpret this mission. But more than anything, I think it's also about having an attitude of service and really seeing yourself as being in service to your audience rather than talking at them, trying to be there for them and have that two-way conversation going. So, a year before last, one of our reporters was a Pulitzer finalist for a piece that he did about opioid addiction treatments. And it was one of the first and a very powerful and comprehensive piece that basically demonstrated that abstinence-based 12-step programs were really deadly for people facing opioid addiction, and that the risk of relapse was very, very high. And the science that he elevated in this piece and the reporting that he did has really shifted the conversation on medical treatment for opioid addiction. And so, we've been talking about how do we take that further, and how do we, not as activists, not, as treatment activists. And so we are creating a newsletter and a private Facebook group that's essentially a gathering place for people who are dealing with the opioid epidemic. So people who are caregivers, people who are recovering, and it's a place where we can put in lots of articles and information that might be useful, but more importantly, it's a safe space because it's private and you have to ask to be let in. It's a safe space where people can have like deep conversations about the issues that are facing them. So that's just a few things that we're trying, but it's a work in progress, and it's really an experiment in thinking about what that relationship with the audience could look like. So, yeah.
I have a question here from Twitter. This comes from Nicole Rhodes, and I think it's a good follow-up to what you're just discussing. What might the mix of digital and IRL platforms look like in order to impart solidarity at a time when we're so polarized, especially online?
Yeah, I mean, I think the IRL means in real life to those of you who, like me, have only recently learned this term. The I think that the mix of those things is really important. I think news organizations are increasingly realizing that these tenuous links that we have via other people's platforms, meaning Facebook or Twitter, they're really fragile, and getting people really involved with the stories that we're telling and getting them to take action around those stories and contribute to our stories requires a mix of both digital points of contact and in real life points of contact. So the bus tour was a really big and ambitious attempt at that. We're looking at ways, perhaps through the partners that we worked with over the course of the bus tour, to solidify relationships with those communities and deepen them so that we can do more in the places that we've identified, and have multiple touch points in that way. Because I do think that we're all living in this world where online communication feels so cheap, and real life communication feels so precious. It's a new year. We've all made resolutions. Mine was to spend less time on social media. So here I am, IRL. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for very important insights I got from your talk. I appreciate them. My question has to do with your 25-city bus tour and the last part of your remarks about solidarity. On your bus tour, how much of the divisions that plague Americans did you see and experience? And the related question, did you get any thoughts from what you did see on the bus tour about how to begin to build the solidarity and bridge the gaps that you were talking about at the end of your remarks?
Yeah, I mean, we saw, we really tried to make this a nonpartisan effort. And one of the ways that we tried to make these not political conversations, meaning political that's happening at that national level, those hot button issues that everybody has a point of view on, even if they don't directly impact their lives. We actually did some training with our journalists with an organization called the Center for Civic Dialogue at the University of Arizona, and we actually had them come in and train our reporters about how to have a kind of open-ended conversation about that would produce fruitful insights. Reporters tend to be trained to, I need to get my quote, so you ask a series of leading questions, hopefully one that's going to provoke a juicy quote that you can then use high up in your story. And the truth is that is tends to not actually capture how people actually feel and think. It's something that you've kind of pulled out of them. So our goal was to have much more open-ended conversations with people about their communities, about the issues that are on their minds. So one of the first and clearest instructions we gave was like, don't lead with politics. Talk to people about their community. What are they proud of? What do they want to see change? And I think that was really, really useful. Because it started the conversation on kind of a different plane, and it meant that these were conversations that involved people of every political background, of every religious background, of every hue, and we did a lot of outreach. We used, we spent money on Facebook, sending out ads to people's feeds saying, hey, come on down and be interviewed, and we tried to hold we tried to put the bus in places where we felt we get a good cross-section of different kinds of people. It's not a scientific survey because it's a self-selecting group that ultimately decides, yeah, I'm going to get on your bus and spend 10 minutes with you. But I do think that we got a pretty good cross-section of the country. In terms of insights, I think that what's really clear is that people want stories that focus on solutions rather than problems. People want to read things that help them figure out how to solve problems in their communities, which is not easy, right? I mean, journalism is all about bad things. It's about the fire. It's about the genocide. And so writing stories that are about people finding solutions to problems can be challenging for journalism. But that came through loud and clear. The other thing is that people are really, really, really worried about jobs and healthcare in this country. And that came through everywhere that we went, that there's deep concern about economic security, and about whether people are going to get access to adequate health care. Those were pretty much everywhere we went. Now, we have thousands of hours of video, and we're just we're working with a research firm that's actually going to analyze all of these conversations and help us extract insights from them. So that work is ongoing, and we're going to be producing a bunch of different reports based on what we learned from that. But it was pretty remarkable. So.
How about another one
Sure.
from Twitter? This is from Julie Halpert. She writes, you use many unpaid contributors at HuffPost, which is hard on journalists. Do you plan to continue that model?
So we do not use unpaid contributors, and most of our contributors are actually people who publish on our site, but also publish in places like Medium and LinkedIn and elsewhere. We employ, in the United States, about 200 journalists. We pay them good salaries and benefits. So I think that the contributor model, when it was created in 2005, was really revolutionary. It didn't exist. The idea that you could, on someone else's platform, hand over the mic to other people and let them publish what they think. And we often hear this criticism that, oh, HuffPost is built its glory on the back of unpaid contributors. We are all unpaid workers in the data mines of Facebook. Every single one of us. Facebook made, I don't know, $10 billion in profit in the last quarter. Facebook destroyed the business model of journalism. So people are welcome to criticize the HuffPost contributor platform for not paying people, but the idea that HuffPost singularly helped destroy journalism is kind of laughable when you think about the role that Google and Facebook played. And as for the future of the platform, stay tuned.
I enjoyed your speech. And my name is Shirley Beckley, and I'm a resident of Ann Arbor for my lifetime here. And I want to address the racism statement as opposed to the word nigger. Racism is a system. Nigger was a term given to our ancestors that were brought over here. That's the difference. Racism sounds nasty to you, but it's the way you have run this country. So you shouldn't look at it as such a bad word, and you certainly can't compare it to the word nigger, which was given to our ancestors in a derogatory term.
More questions from Twitter? Or, sorry, we have someone here. Go ahead.
I'd like to frame a question around a set of questions that appear in the flyer describing today's event. So the flyer asks the following questions. Is kneeling during the national anthem a show of disrespect or a display of patriotism? Is extending a welcome to immigrants and refugees central to American ideals or a threat to them? Is the Confederate flag a symbol of heritage or racism? I'm wondering what your thoughts are regarding coming to a common understanding of the answers to those questions, whether you think that's possible in a relatively short period of time, or if questions like these and others will be questions that we have in many generations.
I mean, I think I don't know that we'll have those particular questions in many generations, but I think that you only have to look at the favorability ratings of Dr. Martin Luther King circa 1967 versus the favorability ratings of Dr. Martin Luther King circa 2018. I mean, when things are in the past, they take on a kind of rosy glow, and we think, I mean, I feel like Nike used the image of the black athletes who put their fists up at the Olympics as an advertisement. You know, at the time that happened, it was unthinkable. I mean, these guys were communist traitors. You know, they were not Americans. Muhammad Ali, he was a radical. He was a traitor. He refused to fight in Vietnam. Now he's like a teddy bear. You know, the greatest. Even Donald Trump loves him. So I mean, I think it's. I mean, to me, and this comes back to this question of amnesia. You know, at this moment, we're all worked up about this question, and then we'll reach a point of so-called progress, and then we'll look back and we'll say, Colin Kaepernick, great American hero. They'll have his face on a postage stamp. And in the meantime, that guy will never again play professional football. His career will be over, which is probably good for his brain, but you know, leave that aside. I know this is a football town, but. I'm optimistic that the American tradition of amnesia will continue and that we will very well look back and say, oh boy, those brave NFL players, or those, you know, think about the people in the civil rights movement, what they sacrificed. And their consolation is being on a postage stamp, having changed the country, but like their own lives individually, what they sacrificed. Jobs, careers, lives, children, you know, you look at the families of both Dr. King and Malcolm X and the heartbreak that came after what happened to their children, the difficulties that their children have. You know the price that they paid. So, you know, I mean, I don't know if this answers your question, but I think we'll all look back 20 years from now and we'll have moved on. We'll have moved forward, right? The ball will move forward, and we'll have a kind of hazy glow on the events that are unfolding now that feel like they're tearing the country apart, but we'll all think those were heroes.
So we will come to it.
After a long time. Yeah. Questions?
Another one from Twitter. Okay, this reads, the level of income inequality in the United States is for a developed country staggering. I guess this speaks to optimism. Do you ever see it declining, the income inequality, I guess is the question.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of folks have been thinking about income inequality in the United States for a long time because having covered other countries where income inequality is extremely high, I've just seen the pernicious effects of that. And this, again, comes down to this question of American identity. One of the core tenets of American identity is the idea of social mobility, the idea that you can start from nothing and become something. Now, it's always been an imperfect promise. It's been a promise that's been true, more true for certain people than for others. There have been people who've been excluded for years by this, out of this, who've been outside of this promise. But it's really core to our identity. And I think that the thing that frightens me is that if we're reaching a point where we're becoming an immobile society in the absence of a European-style kind of welfare state where, you know, a certain level of standard of living is made available to everyone, that seems like a recipe for major societal unrest. Having a system based on competition and mobility and the possibility of constant forward motion allows you to have a very thin social safety net. And I think most conservatives would argue that a system of competition that allows people to get ahead means that if you have too thick of a social safety net, people won't be motivated to move forward. But if we have a system in which inequality feels just baked right in, then I don't think you have any choice as a society, unless you just want to be, you know, medieval and heartless, than to have a very comprehensive social safety net. Sir.
There's a controversy here on campus about this fair.
Could you talk in the microphone? I want people to be able to hear you.
This character named Richard Spencer, who's supposed to be trying to come here to speak, And some universities have said no, that they will not allow him to come. Our university has said we can't say that because of freedom of speech. Of course, we know places he's been before have had problems, and other places where his ilk have spoken have had similar kinds of difficulties. Do you have any opinions on freedom of speech versus whatever?
Public safety? I think this is one of the really tough issues that all of us are grappling with right now. I mean, for example, we had an opportunity to interview Richard Spencer on HuffPost, and we were very careful at how we framed the interview, how much room we gave him to just kind of spout off his own opinions, what kinds of questions we asked him. But as a general matter, I actually don't believe in this no platform thing. I don't really believe that that we should put certain kinds of speech outside the bounds and beyond the pale. I went to a small liberal arts college called St. John's College, and I was very lucky. I was a scholarship student. They have a great books curriculum, and it's a school that attracts a significant number of conservative students because it has a kind of dead white men curriculum that has very much gone out of fashion. It was a great education for me. It's not for everybody. But some of my classmates are, had jobs like chief of staff to Newt Gingrich. A close friend of mine had Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative on a poster in his dorm room, and I remember going there to drink beer and consume other things. That was just it. And, I found tremendous value in a politically heterodox education. I found tremendous value in being around people who did not share my views. William F. Buckley Jr. was the commencement speaker the year that my wife graduated, and there was some controversy, not like you'd have now, but some members of the faculty didn't love the idea. Now, what I'm talking about is a long way away from Richard Spencer, right? I'm talking about ordinary conservative beliefs. Things have become so polarized now, and also so unpredictable. We're seeing, outbreaks of violence when these kinds of things happen. What happened in Charlottesville, I think, has really terrified a lot of people. I think there are legitimate concerns about public safety in an environment where people like him speak. But as a journalist, and frankly as a citizen, I'm not in love with the idea of saying that somebody's voice shouldn't be heard.
I'll jump in here because Lydia and I were talking about this earlier. When you come to Wallace House, there's a small washroom on the first floor, and it has painted around the wall. Did you go in today? The quote, I hate what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Interestingly, in the mansplaining universe, that quote was not from Voltaire. It's actually painted on we have to actually update the wall because it's credited to Voltaire. It was actually written by a woman who was paraphrasing Voltaire in a book about him. So history corrects itself as time goes on, but those are a woman's words. We were talking about this Richard Spencer idea today. I know that there are students in the back of the room. I'm going to give you a couple more chances to come down here because you're in a room where somebody started the question and answer session with a very provocative challenge that I think maybe was meant to shut down conversation in the room rather to encourage it. And you might want to leave here and go talk on Twitter. But we're actually in a room together. And it's a better place to ask your questions and have conversation here than to leave and talk about the question that offended you at this conversation. So I hope that you will come to the microphone before we leave. But Lydia and I were talking about this Richard Spencer notion and how tricky it is around free speech. And I was reminded of my own college days. I was with the Black Action Society at University of Pittsburgh and also with the Programming Council, the Student Programming Council, who brought speakers to campus. And we tried to get a bigger range of speakers as we possibly could, big names who would stir things up. And one speaker who we invited to campus created a lot of controversy. And people insisted that we not bring the speaker to campus, that it would incite violence, that it was hateful. I went back to look at some of the newspaper articles in Pittsburgh at this time, and if you looked at them, the arguments made and the sentiments expressed were very similar to the ones we're reading now about Richard Spencer. I graduated in 1990. Can anybody guess who the speaker was? Hateful, violent, would tear the country and the city apart. No, it was Louis Farrakhan. And the arguments were almost exactly the same.
Well, that's the point, right? Is that, you know, one day the shoe's going to be on another foot.
Right.
And that whatever the prevailing enforcer of norms is, you don't know what side of that enforcement you're going to be on.
That's right. Anyway, we brought Louis Farrakhan to campus. He did what Louis Farrakhan did at the time, and there were a lot of people there. There were counter-protests, and ultimately, I think it created a lot of interesting discussions on campus. I don't think any of this is to say that we agree with anything that Richard Spencer has to say, and I think we were talking about earlier, the way you answer speeches with more speech, the way you address Richard Spencer is counter-program against him. Get a bigger room, get a bigger speaker, get somebody else out that has views that may counteract what he may have to say. But if you silence Richard Spencer, then who do they come for next, and who's silenced next, and when does that hit you? And I think that's the tricky question that we're all wrestling with here, and the conversations have certainly been interesting.
Well, yeah, and I think that the tradition that I grew up in, and I'm, in my early 40s, was one of more rather than less speech. And I think that this may be a generational thing, but it feels that the generation below mine, younger than mine, has a different view about speech that I would love to hear about. If anyone wants to make the case.
I have
Hi.
a question about like the polarization that we've been talking about. Because like for me as a student, it's really worrisome because I'm going to be living in this world for a little while, hopefully. So what do you think is going to happen with that polarization in the coming years? Like if it's going to be solved or if it's going to like tear apart?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is always a persistent question. At various points, the country has felt like it's at a breaking point, that there's polarization that cannot be resolved, and then somehow it resolves. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s. The Civil War gave way to Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And does that mean that things resolved? No, they didn't really resolve. They just kind of muddled along, and eventually we found our way to that slightly more perfect, but still not completely perfect union. I frankly blame television, particularly cable television, for the polarization narrative. I think that in many ways, when you talk to people about things that are not Donald Trump, Congress, abortion, immigration, the kind of like the big hot button issues of the moment, you can have perfectly civil, non-polarized conversations. But as soon as you embed it in this kind of hothouse environment of cable TV shout fests, it seems like all is lost. And so I've never bought the idea that human beings are themselves polarized. You know, everyone lives in a heterodox environment where they encounter people with different points of view, people who don't agree with them, people who live differently than they are, and they have to somehow negotiate and work with that. Nobody really, you know, this idea that people are filter bubbling out absolutely everything that they don't agree with. They have a cousin, they have a relative. I mean, that's how, you know, gay rights happened. You know, people eventually realized that they were completely surrounded by gays and they couldn't kill them all, so we may as well just learn to live with them, you know. And so, you know, I think that that's the way that change happens and that progress happens. It happens slowly, painfully, with proximity, and it really actually relies on what I think most people have, which is manners, you know, and the civility and willingness to listen to one another. And I think we've all been trained by cable TV news to think that informed debate is people shouting at each other. But that's certainly not my experience of informed debate. There are hothouse environments, and probably the two hottest of hothouse environments for this kind of so-called debate are college campuses and cable television. So just get to graduation and you'll be fine. I mean, I think it's a great question. Now, I will say, sorry, he said there's a lot of money to be made in fomenting the polarization, you know. And I think that's only partially true, right? Now, if you look at, if I had a whiteboard, I would get up and draw this. But if you look at the media landscape, right? Like where all of the investments are being made in media, they're actually not. No one who's looking to make money is actually investing in propaganda, right? I mean, you have like you have kids in Moldova who are, you know, publishing fake news on Facebook. They're making like a little bit of money, right? But if you look at where venture, you know, capitalists, and if you look at where big media companies are investing in the places where they think there's going to be the most return, they're actually primarily investing in slightly left of center, free-to-consumer digital media organizations, BuzzFeed, Vox, HuffPost, Vice, that kind of thing. Now, on the other side of this spectrum, free-to-consumer but right-wing, you have a few digital news organizations that are propped up by, they're essentially hobby sites, right? I mean, Breitbart is propped up by the money of the Mercer family. There's no equivalent of that on you know, at BuzzFeed or at Vox or whatever, right? So Breitbart has lost 50% of its audience. It's, you know, advertisers have been pressured to stop advertising on the site, so they've lost a tremendous amount. But I think that at the bottom of it, just like Rupert Murdoch runs the New York Post at a loss because he just loves it. You know, a lot of this kind of like right-wing cesspool stuff is less about making money from fomenting division than it is about serving a larger political agenda. Now, the larger political agenda maybe is how they plan to make lots of money, right? Like the Mercers fund Breitbart because they want to get support for the kinds of policies like the tax cut that the Trump administration just ran. So. And then, of course, you have Fox News, which remains a highly profitable division of Fox. And I think one could fairly say it's pretty divisive programming. But its audience is aging, like much of the audience for television is. And you're seeing a digital media landscape where the vast majority of investment and the vast majority of growth is actually seen on the left rather than on the right.
So I think we're going to wrap it up. Lydia, thank you for thought-provoking comments. I think one of the interesting things for me about this conversation is that in the idea of this polarized environment and what people's perceptions are of media, I think a lot of people see HuffPost as on the left, and so expected that the conversation today was going to be a raucous confirmation of what right-thinking, left-thinking people think, loud and proud, and so people could clap and cheer rather than get into like quotes from de Tocqueville and like complicated stuff that there was not easy answers to. And even when somebody pressed for an answer to an unreasonable question, to meet it with a simple answer rather than a shout. And that's what we believe in, and we're going to be doing more of that on campus. These flyers that you got when you came in, I want to please encourage you to come out to the rest of our events that deal with free speech and inclusion. And those of you who have been to other Wallace House events have heard me say this. It is not a slight at all to those of you who I've seen at many events, but I want to see more students at our events for in-person conversations. And not the people who Lydia talked about who get the New York Times newspaper print copy delivered on their doorstep every day. I want to see the people come to the events who live off of this, like I do, sadly. But we have some events coming up. On January 31st, we have another Livingston winner, Brooke Jarvis, coming to talk about her winning story for national reporting called Beyond the Wall, the Human Toll of Border Crossings. If you want to look up Brooke's story, you can find it on the Wallace House website under the Livingston Awards tab. But she wrote an amazing, beautiful piece for the California Sunday magazine called Unclaimed about the story of a John Doe, basically, who his story is unknown. He crossed the border, and her story opened up this nuanced web of what it is like for families who are tied up in the real story of border crossings. And again, not a sensational story that's hitting at the top of what's being argued about on the news, but something that gets into real life issues. And Brooke will be here on January 31st. On February 15th, a Thursday evening, later than we have most of our events, we have most of our events in roughly this late afternoon window. We're having this February 15th event from 6 to 7:30, so more people can come who work and have classes during the day. It's called Speak Freely, Debating the First Amendment in a Changing America. If you listen to Michigan radio every day, you know that there's a daily news program by NPR called 1A with Joshua Johnson. We're bringing that show here to campus. They will be doing the show live downstairs here in Rackham Auditorium, programmed with people from campus to talk about a lot of the issues that Lydia brought up today about free speech and what free speech means today and where the lines are drawn. And we know that that will be an interesting event. So please join us for that on February 15th. And on February 20th, Brett Stevens, a columnist for the New York Times, is coming for a talk called Free Speech and the Necessity of Discomfort. That will be in the Lydia Mendelson Theater. And then we have one of our own fellows this year, Marc Monnier, who's sitting back in the upper right for me, joining another former fellow in March for a talk on China's soft power, understanding Beijing's growing worldwide influence. So I hope to see many of you out, and I hope students, you bring your friends out. And those of you whose faces are becoming familiar to me, thank you for coming again, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.